Thank you for joining us for the Video Guest Artist Lecture Series at Northwestern Oklahoma State University. Today we are joined by Levi Hastings, illustrator out of Seattle, Washington. Levi, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for me.
Please tell us about the type of work that you do and how you got into your current business and what type of what drives you, what's your inspiration, things like that.
Yeah, okay, so I'm an illustrator and artist and sometimes cartoonist and designer in Seattle. I'm sort of multidisciplinary creative. So I've been doing illustration work incorporated 10 years professionally. And I'm doing more and more freelance work in addition to a full-time graphic design job. But my illustration work and my artwork are definitely my primary passion, and so I've really been trying to build up a freelance career, moving more in that direction. So yeah, I've got a pretty good collection of work to show you today, which kind of will hopefully walk you through my highlights from probably the last 10 years or so.
Sounds great. Would you mind sharing? Great.
You ready?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Is that working on your end?
Yes. Could you go to full screen so we could see just the image?
Yeah.
Okay.
Does that work for you?
Yeah, that works.
Okay. Let me hide toolbar. So we're just going to start out with this is a piece from a while ago, and I just kind of I'm showing my digital illustration from I don't know, I guess about 7-8 years ago. So here, this is just sort of a good example of what kind of the style I used to kind of work in. Primarily with I would usually start with an ink drawing and then move into, I would scan those in and do colors in Photoshop. And this is a pretty prime example of I was working in that mode. I mean, I honestly still kind of work in that mode to a large degree, but from a stylistic standpoint, I think my work has changed quite a bit. But this is, I think, just a prime example of kind of what I was working on probably 7-8 years ago. So you can see the, line work and then the colors are pretty much, they work together, but the, the line work is kind of the primary key. It's really a drawing with some colors behind it.
Great.
So actually, let me go back. So here's another version of that where I've kind of done a drawing in ink, scanned it in, and I'm doing colors in Photoshop as sort of layered underneath it. Adding in some textured backgrounds and things like that. Pretty rough inks, pretty rough colors, but just sort of to create a mood and trying to get some atmospheric feelings in there. And these were actually just kind of projects that I thought would sort of exemplify that style from that period. But I'm also doing a lot of, full-on watercolor at this point as well. So, using, ink washes and, doing pen and ink drawings on top of the ink or on top of the watercolor as a way of, kind of blending those two images together and, creating an atmosphere in a very different way. And with a lot of my watercolor, it'll end up going online at some point anyway. So all of my paintings I will scan in and do editing in Photoshop anyway. So ultimately, it's always going to end up in some sort of digital format. But for a long time, I had a really sort of difficult time getting the watercolor and the digital techniques in kind of a cohesive way.
Okay.
So for of a piece that I did a couple of years ago for Digital Americana magazine, this was a cover they did, and it was one of the first iPad-only magazines, and they were doing a series, or their issue was, you know, thematic. So each issue has a different theme. This one was on consumption, and obviously, I think we've all had an experience with something like this where, you know, we drop our phone and the screen shatters, and, you know, we become so personally attached to our phones that it's sort of a instant tragedy. So I just sort of had this idea of this kind of, you know, replacing of phones, and that they've become very disposable, and we get very, very attached to them. But if they break or are cracked, we kind of instantly replace them. So this was a case in where I was really trying to blend the two, sort of ink and drawings, line drawings, and the watercolor and the digital in a different way. And so this was kind of the first piece where I felt like they were really kind of working together. So in this case, I'm, you know, I'm doing watercolor textures, just painting them, scanning them in. I'm doing drawings on a separate layer, scanning those in, and I'm just kind of layering them all together in Photoshop, creating sort of glow effects on this final piece that, you know, is just sort of Photoshop brushes essentially. Here's an example of kind of how the magazine actually mocked it up. So this is how it would look on the cover of the magazine and on the digital format on the.
Great.
So this was a campaign I did for the Big Sky Documentary Film Festival in Missoula, Montana, a couple of years ago. So I actually I went to Montana State University in Bozeman. So I lived in Montana for several years, which I really loved. And these guys found my work, some college work that I'd done or something, and they got a hold of me and wanted they wanted, you know, to use a Montana connection, but they liked my really kind of project for me as a way of kind of getting back to my roots and working in Montana again, even from afar. But they really kind of gave me free rein, and I wanted to use this sort of, again, combination of digital and hand-drawn techniques to kind of put together a cohesive piece. So this was, you know, a lot of inking on, like, the buffalo. I inked by hand the camera and these separate pieces, and actually the text was all hand-drawn.
Oh, wow.
And then I scanned it all in, you know, and kind of, you know, made some edits and stuff in Photoshop. So a lot of back and forth. I ended up doing, you know, and usually I do end up doing a bit of editing in Photoshop for client work. Even if the main work is primarily hand-drawn, I'll end up editing quite a bit, just to fit whatever the client's needs are. So this was a piece. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with The Stranger, which is Seattle's weekly magazine. If you're familiar with Dan Savage, it's sort of his paper that he started, I guess, about 20 years ago, chief. And anyway, it's kind of the big Seattle all-weekly newspaper. So I started doing a lot of work for them over the last few years. And this was the first piece that I did, was the winter survival guide. So it came out in November. We don't have as terrible winters as the rest of the country, but it is still kind of dark and gloomy and cold. And so they came up with a survival guide to you know, help people get through it. And one of this article was about how a hot tub can save your life in the winter. So this was a really fun project. And again, I was trying to kind of meld those two, the hand-drawn with the digital and the watercolor. And so this is essentially three major pieces where I did my watercolor scans, just texturing essentially and coloring those in as different layers, and then doing a line drawing and kind of merging the two, and then doing a lot of kind of paintbrush, brushing over top to create the sort of steam effects, and the little line indicate the reflections and stuff. So that was a pretty fun project.
Great.
Then another one of my big projects for them was this illustration, which ended up on the cover. There's a neighborhood called South Lake Union, and it's just kind of exploded with construction lately. It's the neighborhood where the new are, and the entire neighborhood is just giant apartments, high rises. And I used to live down there, and we moved away. And there was a discovery. One of the construction sites, they had discovered a mammoth tusk as they were digging for the foundations. And I am a huge about dinosaurs and any kind of prehistoric extinct creature, and mammoths are one of my favorite creatures. So I was very excited about this news that they had discovered a mammoth in my old neighborhood. And I had, by this point developed a pretty good relation. I just emailed them and I was like, hey, are you guys going to do an article about this story? Because I think it's pretty awesome. And if you do, I definitely want to illustrate it because this is my alley. And they were like, yeah, I don't know that we're really going to do a story on it, but I mean, do you maybe want to do a cover? Like, that could be cool. I was like, oh, wow, that's okay, sure. So I came up with this sort of ghost mammoth stomping through the streets of South Lake Union in the middle of the construction zones and all the new high-rise buildings, and kind of, stalking its old territory. And I did a lot of inking on the actual mammoth itself. Those are primarily inks, and then I used pencil for the buildings. And pencil is something I haven't really used since I was in high school. I did a lot of pencil drawing in high school, and then I kind of left it behind in college. And so it was kind of fun to go back and do some, shading in pencil, and kind of create those different moods and textures with, it's such a simple tool, but so it was nice to kind of go back and rediscover that. And then I scanned it in and, did a lot of all the coloring actually in Photoshop. So this was the result, and this was the cover. So my first stranger cover, it was pretty exciting.
Fantastic. Could you tell us a little bit more about your interest in prehistoric animals and creatures?
Oh, sure. I was actually really young kid, I was just always really drawn to them. Actually, dinosaurs were the first thing drawing, so I can actually credit them with kind of teaching me how to draw, essentially. I would just spend hours and hours going through the National Geographics and all the books that my parents would get me. I would draw my toys. Like, it was one of those first obsessions, and it honestly never really left me. It kind of has come and gone over the years, but I really kind of think it's one of those things where, you try to grow up and get over the things that you were into as a kid, and then as an adult, you kind of rediscover them and realize, hey, there's no shame in loving the stuff I loved as a kid. So I've been doing a lot more dinosaur prehistoric related illustration work lately, which has actually been really successful. I recently tabled at Emerald City Comic-Con for the second year, and I did a whole series of dinosaurs. Unfortunately, I didn't actually put these in the collection, but yeah, they just, like, people were loving them, and I pretty much sold out all of my prints of the dinosaurs. So people love them, and I think everybody's always a little excited / surprised when they realize that other people are as into them as they are. So yeah, and obviously, mammoths and mammals are not dinosaurs, but they sort of fit into the prehistoric extinct creature category, which I think kind of, it captures all of our imaginations, and that it's like it's a giant creature that is no longer here, so we can sort of fill in the blanks.
Right.
And there's always that fantasy element, even though there's obviously a lot of science that goes on. But I think the fact that it's sort of there's this giant sort of in our knowledge of like we don't know what the colors were. There's just certain things that we'll never be able to know. So we fill in the gaps with our own imaginations, and so I think that's a magical combination.
Do you think your time in Montana State influenced your prehistoric animal drawings any?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. That's because Jack Horner, one of the famous paleontologists, he's kind of based out of Bozeman, and the Museum of the Rockies is. I'm not sure if he helped found that museum, but he has a huge sort of influence. I mean, it's a really big, wonderful museum with all kinds of amazing sort of prehistoric dino fossils, and he heard that the big egg nests of the hadrosaurs in Montana and the Badlands in Montana are just littered with fossils. So some of the biggest dinosaur discoveries have come out of Montana. So that was a really big, definitely a really big influence on my kind of dinosaur obsession. It was a really good place to be, going to school and going to art school, especially. We'd actually have life drawings, where we would go to the museum and just draw dinosaur bones, which was pretty awesome.
Sounds great.
Yeah. Okay, moving on. So this was a piece based on Game of Thrones. I'm sure you guys are all familiar, either the shows or the movies. But there's a gallery here in Seattle that recently closed, sadly, called LTD, and they were primarily a pop culture gallery. So they would specialize in video games and movies and toys and sort of nostalgia for anything pop culture nerd related. And they did a huge Game of Thrones show last year. So it was 2014, spring of 2014, in conjunction with Emerald City Comic Con. And they invited me to be part of the show. And I contributed this piece, which is based on the character Brienne of Tarth, who is my personal favorite of all the characters, which is hard to pick a favorite, but she's one of mine. And this was one I wanted to show just because it was, again, kind of my experimenting with different techniques and combinations where I drew out the figure and the armor in multiple layers. So some of the texturing that you see in the armor and in the swords and all of the ruins in the background were all inked on different layers. And then I scanned them and layered them in Photoshop and did quite a bit of painting in Photoshop after all the pieces were scanned in. And it was just kind of obviously a fun piece today, but I was kind of happy with how the piece, some of these textures turned out. One of the big breakthroughs I had over the last year or so was discovering Kyle's Photoshop brushes. Do you guys know Kyle Webster?
No, we don't.
Anyway, so he's an illustrator out of, I believe, South Carolina, but he developed a whole series of really, really incredible Photoshop brushes that have been the best thing I've ever seen that simulate actual materials, like in terms of charcoal, watercolor, pencil. Like they really replicate those materials, and so he's done just an amazing job selling them and promoting them, and changed the way I work. I actually do quite a bit more digital illustration using his brushes because it does really cut out a few steps, especially if I'm under a deadline and there's just not a lot of time to do hand-drawn or painting. They really do help. They go a long way to kind of help fill in some of that gap. Because I actually do think it's really important to do a lot of hand-drawn or hand-created work. I just, there are certain time factors involved with some of these projects that it's possible to wait for paint to dry. And, digital work actually, working on a computer is really can be a lot faster. So I wanted to move on to a different this was last year. So I did a solo show, an art show, which was all based on travel. So the show was called Baggage Claim, and I've done a lot of traveling over the years. And it's kind of another one of my ongoing obsessions. And so I did this whole show based on this. was pretty much all digital. This was one of the first times I've really just started from scratch and worked in a digital medium. And so I did a whole series of these pieces that were all watercolor, and then I did supplementary pieces like this one, which are all digital, but using these techniques and these brushes that I had discovered that I just really found a really great job of simulating the effects of actual watercolor.
Great.
So here's another piece from this series that I did, and really enjoy the pictures and the different color tones. And at this point, I'm kind of moving away from a lot of line work, whereas before I was drawing everything out, and you would sort of see all the lines and the outlines of everything. I've kind of moved away from that to using working with volume and color and to make these shapes really speak for themselves, and using a lot more white space to strengthen the composition and let the shapes and colors do the work for me. So here's another.
Was that a digital piece or was it?
The previous piece was that a digital piece?
This piece?
Yes.
Yes, this is digital. So this was, and with these I will do a sketch. I'll kind of sketch out the composition and, layer it in Photoshop a little bit. I'll do some tweaking in Photoshop, but then I'm kind of creating these shapes and volumes and then painting within them and then erasing the, just deleting that layer of line work. So this is another piece in that series, which again is primarily digital, but using the similar techniques. And I'm really, really happy with how some of these textures turned out in the street scene and in some of these buildings. Experimenting a lot with more colors and volumes rather than specific line work. So this is an example. This is a cover of it. I did a little mini comic last year for Emerald City Comic Con. This is the cover piece, and this is sort of using those Photoshop brushes I was telling you about, which do a really great job of simulating watercolor and creating that texture. But this is all hand drawn initially. So the little diver and the seagrass, those were all hand drawn and inked, and then colored in Photoshop. And here's the sort of the back page of that mini comic, and this has much less of the digital work in it. This was all hand drawn primarily, and then I just added a few little touches up here in the sky, and the color is digital. So I recently had a really awesome opportunity. I was hired by HBO to work with their, I don't know if have heard of the show Looking. It recently finished up its second season on HBO, but they got together a group of 5 creatives, and they each assigned us one of the characters, the main characters. Essentially, I was hired to create a series of portraits based on this character. So they flew us to San Francisco to the set, and we got to meet the creators and the writers and visit the set and work with the actor for, an afternoon, essentially, where we got one-on-one time with the actor to talk about the character And afterwards we were creating these portraits based on our experience and what we knew, and they would be unveiling these over the course of the 5 weeks preceding the second season premiere. So portraits, one of the first portraits in that series. And this was, again, a combination of watercolor and digital techniques where the primary painting has been, is actually painted on watercolor. And then I scanned it in, and all of this sort of texturing and the blankets and in the t-shirt and the background, those are all digital. So trying to kind of make the two techniques work really well together. This is another piece in that series. And in this one, again, I'm using texture, actual scans of watercolor that I painted and incorporating them into digital layers as a mask, layer masks. So I don't know how much you guys are using Photoshop at this point, but layer masking is the best thing you can do. It's amazing. I love it. So yeah, these are essentially just 2 different layers that I've masked with 2 different colors of water texture. And then I've gone in and drawn the lines over top in a separate ink layer. Our color-based version. This is one of the portraits that I essentially wanted to create a mood based on color, and again, kind of erasing the lines where they don't need to be, and sort of implying the relationship between 2 characters that we couldn't be, because of HBO was very concerned about spoilers, and they didn't want us to reveal too much about events in the season, but they wanted us to kind of imply a few things. So it was kind of a tricky little balance to hints of things without giving too much away during the season, but they were very happy with how this piece turned out. And I actually was I really particularly like the pink highlights in the hair. That's kind of one of my favorite parts of this. And this was the final piece in that series, and much more traditional. These are 2 watercolor paintings that I essentially spliced together in Photoshop. So the figure is 1 watercolor painting. All of the background pieces are another watercolor painting. And in this case, one where, watercolor is not a very forgiving medium. So, it's not like oil or acrylic where if you mess up, you can just sort of paint over, try to mask whatever you have underneath. You can't really hide much in watercolor. And if you overwork it, it looks kind of terrible. So I've started developing, a technique of just doing separate pieces of watercolor if I'm actually going to use that texture in my work. So painting things separately, scanning them in separately, and combining them that way. If one thing gets messed up, I'm not messing up the entire piece. So it's working out so far so good on that account.
Good.
So this was another exciting project I did. I don't know if you guys have heard of the Jinx. It's been in the news lately. It is a true crime documentary about Robert Durst and the sort of multiple murders that have happened over the decades that he's sort of related to. So they hired me to do this illustrated timeline of events, and this was to sort of be rolled out in conjunction with the premiere in early February. So they gave me a couple of these these important dates in the story, and had me illustrate them and kind of tie them all together in a cohesive timeline. And they had liked, they liked sort of the inky, sketchy pieces that I had done for the Looking show. So my concept, and they actually really liked the roughness of the sketches and wanted these to sort of reflect that. So the kind of sketchier style for this one. And then I incorporated those watercolor elements and inking way of, providing the atmospherics and background on this one. And the color scheme had to match sort of the, the theme of the posters and all of the sort of the brand guidelines that they had been establishing for the show itself. So in addition to this timeline, I actually doing a little experimentation with GIFs. I haven't done a lot, but I made a little GIF of this, which kind of went through. I don't know that it's really previewing correctly here, but I kind of wanted to use it as a way of highlighting the individual events and kind of establishing sort of a linear narrative. So I can kind of just walk you through a little bit, and it's going a little bit slowly, but I built it in such a way that I would have these elements kind of popping up and disappearing very slowly. So like smudges and fingerprints that would kind of pop up, and the text would disappear and reappear. And they didn't want it to look too bloody and too violent, but they liked kind of the smudginess of it. So I really tried to use that as a way of creating this sort of creepy true crime mood without being gory or disrespectful.
Been animated before this?
I'm sorry?
Are you a big animator?
No, I really do not have. I have very, very little experience with animation. So I've probably only ever made 3 GIFs in my entire life, but I think it's a really interesting technique, and especially from a sort of a comic and narrative background, I think it's really interesting. It's a really kind of creating a mini narrative, especially when everybody's on their phones now, and it's when you're using Instagram or Twitter, or just sort of having like just a tiny looping animation is really amazing. And I think it just kind of gets the point across in a really great way. So I really want to do more work in that realm. Yeah, I'm actually super interested in doing more of that this year.
Great.
This is a work in progress that I wanted to show you. This is a queer sci-fi and fantasy comics anthology, which has been funded through Kickstarter. This day is today, honestly. But yeah, they've been funded. They've gone way beyond their funding goal, which is amazing. The editor asked me to do the cover art for them. So this is kind of the work in progress. This is not finished, but gives you a sense of kind of the direction, and I think it sort of demonstrates a little bit of how I process. So, I'm using a lot of line work in creating this sort of griffin creature, and, establishing, volumes of his body and the feathers, and, the details in the night. But eventually, I think those will be a little more refined, and some of those will disappear entirely. So you'll just have sort of shapes and volumes that will define those elements. And you can see a little bit of that in here in the banner and in the mountains. So yeah, I'm changing kind of the way that I use line work, and trying to bring back more of it into my pieces, so that it's not entirely just volumes. But I'm sort of experimenting with ways in which to use it that don't necessarily outline objects. They sort of they enhance them without actually defining them, if that makes sense. So that should be finished up soon. And so the last few images I wanted to show you are actually process images. So with a lot of my freelance editorial work, I am given a job by an art director at a magazine or a newspaper, and they'll give me kind of the idea and the outline of the story, and I'll submit sketches. And so typically my sketches are pretty rough. It's mostly from a time standpoint. Like, I just don't have time to do a lot of work in the sketch. And if you honestly don't want to put a lot of time into them, because that time can be spent working on the final. So sketches start out pretty rough, but I'll usually submit 1 or 2, maybe 3, depending on the project and the timeline. So in this case, this project was for the Oregon Beer Guide with Willamette Week, which is the Portland weekly newspaper, kind of the equivalent of The Stranger, but in Portland. And so there's a bit more of a, this was a special issue, so it's all about beer and breweries within a day drive of Portland. And so they were highlighting a couple of the regions outside of Portland. So this is for Hood River. And they wanted to kind of highlight the Columbia River Gorge and the windsurfing that goes on there. So I did a couple of sketches for this, and they liked the one. And this was, again, sort of, they wanted multiple updates. So, and some clients do, some clients don't. It really depends on who I'm working with. Some clients are very hands-off and are like, 1 sketch is fine, just, okay, that's great, let's go with this, we trust you. And then you want to kind of be part of the process the entire way. So this is a pretty hideous mock-up here, but I was submitting color studies and kind of, okay, here's another updated version of the sketch we decided. So it's pretty ugly, but and then we move, and here is the final. So these were spot illustrations, so they're very printed very small. So the level of detail was not really required. They really wanted to kind of get more of just shapes and moods too. So, but this sort of shows like the final result after those other sketches. So, and then one more little piece on this. So again, this was highlighting the Northern Oregon coast, and they liked the top version better, and so then they wanted a few more like, and then this was the final. So that shows a little bit of my process. Hopefully that somewhat enlightening. And those are all the pieces I have to share today. Right. Do you have any questions?
Sure. So it seems like a lot of your illustrations, they have a very hand-drawn quality. I mean, unless you told us, I know that I wouldn't be able to tell. I don't know how the rest of my students feel, but is there a reason why you like to hang up to this very, I don't know, to show your artist's hands more, to kind of have the more of a traditional art quality to the way and these looks?
I've always just been really attached to the mark making itself. Whether it's watercolor or ink or pencil. Right. I think that the digital tools that we have now are so incredible and so useful, but I really do think that there was a phase in the late 90s, early 2000s where everything just looked really, you can just tell, and it's just very slick and it's very kind of plasticky looking. And I think for some people's work that absolutely works amazingly, and that's for some artists, like that's the aesthetic, and they absolutely play with that aspect of it. But for my work personally, the kind of work that resonates with me and the kind of work that I want to do, it's important for me to have that sort of texture, or sort of at least the sense that like it was made by human hands. And I think especially in the last 2 years, I've worked and incorporated the two so much more closely that it's hard for me sometimes from a particular, just from a mark making standpoint, it's even hard for me to kind of difference. Like there are definitely times in their jobs that I'm more just like, I'm going to draw on the computer, like with I have a tablet, I have a Wacom, I would love to get a Cintiq, but I'm not there yet. But it's for the sake of time and energy, it's just faster to draw digitally. And at this point, like, you do enough practice and the tools are good enough that you can almost, you almost end up with the same results, depending on what the ultimate result is. Are you doing, if it's for an editorial assignment, almost definitely it's digital. But for an art show, I'm almost never working digitally. I'm almost always doing hand painted, and hand-drawn work. Even though it's ultimately that will be scanned, it will be digitized, I will be sharing it online. I think at this point, as professionals, we realize how important it is to have your work out there, and all of that, means you have to have it scanned or photographed, or it's online in some way. And there are certain, it just makes sense in a lot of ways to just sort of create that work on a computer. But yeah, I mean, it's and I'm still experimenting all the time, and I'm using new techniques and trying to kind of figure out the best way that works for me. The piece that is up right now is not typical of what I was doing even 2 years ago. So, I think it's important to kind of always be learning and be constantly trying to keep in mind what it is that got you into it in the first place.
So do you have a preference in the medium, or is it more of an efficiency of the particular project, be it say your gallery show, or is it for editorial or something like that? Do you have anything that you prefer more than the other?
I really do love seeing my work in print. I love doing, and it's really great working with art directors. But the nice thing about that is that the delivery is so seamless at this point. Like I just email, I create the final file and I send them a Dropbox link. And it's, then it's done and it's in print or it's on the web or whatever. So that's a really nice way of delivering final work. With gallery shows, the thing that I dislike the most is the framing and the hanging, and there's all this work that goes on around the actual artwork that really has nothing to, it has, you have to have a presentable piece, and framing actually is very important when you're looking at a gallery show. A badly framed piece can ruin the whole thing. But that's the part I like the least about it. It's it can be expensive, and if you don't really know what you're doing, it can be just a nightmare. But I love, the great thing about a gallery show is that it's, you get that immediate direct response from people. It's in the real world. And I think, sometimes we forget, especially as artists and, working in a digital way in, this kind of period of time, like we kind of forget how important it is to get away from our, interact in the real world. So the great thing about a gallery show is you do end up seeing, people, and they're responding to your work in real time in a real way. And, you end up seeing a lot of other fellow artists who normally aren't, you don't see in another context either way. So yeah, I think they both fill a very, very important place in my life. And I think I'm going to continue to do both. And, and I think that's an important thing just in general as a creative, person in this day and age. Like, you have to diversify. You can't just do one thing. It's hard to make it just doing one thing. So doing, I'm kind of just doing a little bit of an editorial, but I'm also doing Comic-Cons and mini comics and web comics and things that I think they all kind of hit a different audience, and they fill a different need from a creative standpoint. And from a financial standpoint, you do some things to pay for other things, but I think they all kind of hopefully will, create a body of work that you're ultimately happy with.
Yeah. So how do you manage the time? Because you said you're a graphic designer. Do you have a full-time graphic designer, I'm assuming? And so where do you find more of your other work, your personal works, your other commission work and things like that? How do you manage the?
It's difficult, I'm not gonna lie. It's I'm currently working, I'm doing a 4-day schedule at my design job. And so like today is my my off day. So I've worked it into a situation where I'm working 4 10s, and then I have a day to do my own work. And then I do a lot of work on nights and weekends as well. And, and that can be tricky when you're balancing, other life, significant others, friends, social life, things like that. You kind of learn to hopefully get more efficient with what you're doing and be selective with the jobs that you take on. And, it's a challenge. That's, there's no getting around it. Ideally, I think, yeah, everybody would love to be able to, just do their art full time. But I think for a lot of us, it's not fully realistic. There's just financial considerations that have to be made. And, and sometimes I think it's actually really it's a nice thing to have a day job in that, like, it's, a form of security that it allows you to do the things you want to do without having to worry about,
right.
How you're going to pay rent. And it's nice to have a paid vacation sometimes. So, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I think sometimes it gets stigmatized a little bit, and, everybody's always like, oh, I just want to do, X, all the time. And it's like, that's come with a whole bunch of different complications in that you're constantly worrying about where the next paycheck is coming from. So there is something liberating about having a job that doesn't relate to your personal work. And I'm actually in a really lucky situation in that my job, the people I work for are very supportive of my extracurricular activities, and they love the fact that I'm doing all these other things outside of work and making a name for myself. It only makes it more, I'm only more of an asset to them if I've got this other stuff going on, and they want people have well-rounded lives. So I think ultimately it's just better for them if they've got employees who are happy. So
yeah, great. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I did. This kind of goes back to what you were talking about in your earlier work. See, over the last year, I've actually gotten into ink washes. I've primarily worked with that, and my last 2 commissions, actually, I incorporated watercolors. But I've done my line work in the ink and then come back with watercolor pencils over that. And you said in your earlier work, watercolored first and then came in with the inks. I wondered if there was any, I don't know, preference on that.
Actually, it kind of depends, but I will primarily do what I used to do. Actually, I used to do describing, where I would draw in ink and then watercolor over it, so that you'd sort of essentially create the shape or the object with ink, and then you just sort of color it in with watercolor.
Right.
And I think that's a fine way of doing it. What I did find though is, like, I would use thicker watercolor, and then the ink it would sort of cover the ink a little bit, so I'd go back over it in ink if I really wanted that line back. So there are times when I would kind of just go back and forth and end up inking over it once again. I don't think there's any really wrong way to do it. I just think it depends on kind of what works for you and what you find to be the best. At this point, what I'm doing is I will do a drawing. Say I'm doing whatever it is, I'm going to do a watercolor piece, but I'm doing all the layouts on a separate sheet of paper, and I'm drawing it almost completely, all the line work, all the shapes, composition, all of it. So I'll draw that in a black marker. I'll outline it in marker, and then I'll light box it. So the watercolor paper will just go over top, and then using a light box, I'll just pencil it in really lightly, and then do the watercolor from there. So I'm not really. What I don't recommend is, like, if it's a piece that you want to keep and preserve long term. Like, what I don't recommend is, like, working out your drawing on the watercolor paper, because you'll end up, if you do end up making mistakes, or you do end up erasing or anything like that, that can really mess up the texture of the paper and the quality of the paint. So I would just, that's just a personal preference of mine. So I would maybe recommend, just being being really light with your actual composition, and then inking and water, doing ink and watercolor, on the final piece once you've kind of laid out the sheet of paper.
Okay.
And light boxes, I feel like, are pretty inexpensive at this point. So, I mean, that's one of those things that took me way too long to figure out. And now that I've been using it, I'm like, where was this my whole life?
I've actually been looking into that, so I will look even farther into that now. So,
All right. Anybody else? All right. I think we are done for the day. Levi, thank you. Your lecture was fantastic, and
Thanks.
fantastic work. Look forward to seeing more of your work. The website that you want to share with the rest of the class here?
Sure. Yeah. It's just my name. My website is levihastings.com, and I have a Etsy store, and my Instagram is actually at Leviathan League. But you can just Google it. I do a lot of Instagram and Twitter. So those are kind of my primary social media outlets. But yeah, you can all find it on my website. So yeah, you can see a lot more of my work there too.
All right. Well, on behalf of Northwestern Oklahoma State University, thank you very much. We'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks a lot.